Which public figures have been insulted, airbrushed, or shortchanged by history? The many criteria we might use to assess this can vary wildly, as history, said to be written by the victors, is an ongoing, evolving process of learning that can change everything we know. Look at Richard III's skeleton and the DNA findings of Cheddar Man. There are doubtless hundreds of examples from Britain and around the world, but here are mine. Anne Boleyn was the second queen of King Henry VIII from 1533 to 1536. She was educated, had exotic French manners, was charismatic, and after she caught the eye of the king, she refused to be just another discarded royal mistress. Anne was not popular with the people, who called her a whore for usurping the wildly popular first wife of Henry, the Spanish Catherine of Aragon. Nevertheless, the pair married in a secret ceremony when Anne became pregnant with their only child, a girl. After just 3 years of marriage, Anne had suffered several miscarriages and fallen from Henry's favour when she failed to give birth to a son. Today we understand that the sex of a baby is determined by its chromosomes' makeup at conception. Their marriage soured, and Henry's eye was already wandering. To be rid of Anne, Henry looked to his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. He was a distant ancestor of Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, as his sister Catherine was Oliver's great-great-grandmother. Thomas concocted false accusations against Anne of adultery and incest, even with her own brother George and the king's friends. Sitting in the jury overseeing her trial and sentencing were Anne's one-time betrothed, Henry Percy, and even her own father Thomas, a cruel twist set up by the vindictive king. After a sham trial for high treason, she was sentenced to death. Anne was beheaded in May 1536 by an expert swordsman from France, a clean execution only held for the nobility. Her disgraced father and her outraged mother Elizabeth were soon estranged from each other and also died within a few years of their children. But this king's whore left an ironic legacy, her daughter, Elizabeth, one of England's greatest ever rulers. Mary Magdalene is indisputably one of the most enigmatic and often misunderstood female figures in history. Her story has been repeatedly contorted and contradicted, and she remains an endless source of inspiration for literature, film, theatre and television. The portrayal of Mary as a prostitute began in 591, when Pope Gregory I conflated Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet. Pope Gregory's Easter sermon resulted in a widespread belief that Mary Magdalene was a repentant prostitute or a promiscuous woman. Misogyny helped darken her reputation. She is mentioned by name 12 times in the canonical Gospels, more than most of the apostles other than Jesus' own family. The epithet Magdalene may refer to the town of Magdala, a fishing town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, and the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, stated that she helped support Jesus' ministry, indicating that she was probably wealthy. The Gnostic Gospels, non-canonical early Christian and Gnostic texts found buried in a jar near an Egyptian town called Nag Hammadi in 1945. They have been variously dated to the 2nd century AD. These texts portray Mary as an apostle, as Jesus' closest and most beloved disciple, and the only one who truly understood his teachings. In the Gnostic Gospels, Mary's closeness to Jesus results in tension with another disciple, Peter, due to her sex and Peter's envy of the special teachings given to her. In the Gospel of Philip's text, she is described as Jesus' companion, as the disciple Jesus loved the most and the one Jesus kissed on the mouth, which has led some to conclude that she and Jesus were in a relationship. Sometimes in films and literature, she is portrayed as Jesus' wife. But in 1969, the Vatican released an embarrassing official turnaround. Hidden behind the euphoria of the moon landing, At last, Mary was now not a prostitute or a sinner. Also, if she was somehow not special to Jesus, why did the resurrected deity choose to appear in person to her first? Catherine the Great, the only woman in history to have ever gained the epithet. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst into Lutheran Prussian minor nobility in 1729. Her family life was unhappy as her parents were mismatched in age and personality. Her father was a stern 39-year-old soldier and her pretentious, gossipy mother Joanna was only 17. Joanna wanted a useful male heir, so was remote and cruel, often belittling the young Sophie, calling her ugly and worthless. Perhaps the extremely difficult birth after which she recovered in bed for 19 weeks added to this bitterness. Although Sophie was born a princess, her family had very little money. There were more than 300 sovereign entities of the Holy Roman Empire, many of them quite small and powerless, making for a highly competitive political system as the various noble families fought for advantage over one another, often via political marriages. According to her own diary, Sophie was regarded as a tomboy, possibly because she had tended to be quite clumsy and accident-prone. Though she did train herself to master a sword, was witty and confident if not conventionally beautiful. Blossomed in her teens, already receiving marriage proposals, one allegedly from even her younger brother, Frederick Augustus, the hunchbacked prince. Sophie first met her cousin, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, when she was 10 and he was 11. Based upon her writings, she found Peter detestable upon meeting him and calling him an idiot. Unmarried and childless Empress Elizabeth of Russia was desperate for a legitimate heir to secure the Romanov dynasty. She chose Peter, the only son of her older sister, the Grand Duchess Anna Petrovna, who aged 20 had died only days after he was born, and his father died when he was 11. Elizabeth had him educated by the best tutors, but he was bullied and beaten instead. Elizabeth selected Sophie as a bride for Peter. But, now aged 17, as Sophie was now a witty and confident prize waiting to be welcomed and celebrated in Russia, Peter was now a bitter and cruel drunk. Being facially scarred from recent smallpox made him more reclusive, delusional, and dressing up servants as soldiers. Sophie married Peter in 1745 and, even though he drunkenly stated to a horrified Sophie that he could beat his wife any time, she initially spared no effort to ingratiate herself with her new husband, with Empress Elizabeth and the Russian people, and zealously applied herself to learning Russian. She even converted to the Russian Orthodox Church against her Lutheran father's wishes, and was given the name Catherine, Russian Ekaterina, in memory of Elizabeth's mother. As might be predicted, the arranged marriage was desperately unhappy. Peter's mental instability and sadistic bullying worsened. It was not even consummated for 9 years, and even the Empress Elizabeth wrote Catherine impatient, stern letters. Catherine described her marriage with him as, "There is nothing worse than having a child husband." In 1754, she finally bore a son, Paul, after a long painful birth and recuperation period around whom the entire court, Peter and the Empress, now revolved, freezing Catherine out. But, after slowly recovering and as defiant as ever, she gatecrashed Peter's birthday party and ignored those who had snubbed her, and using her sharp wit to rebut others. She was here to stay. Catherine built her own spy network and became sexually involved with numerous other prominent men at her court, several of whom were powerful figures that opposed her husband. In March 1759, Catherine's 15-month-old daughter, Anna Petrovna, died. In her memoirs, Catherine makes no mention of Anna's death, though she was inconsolable and entered a state of shock. After the funeral, Catherine never mentioned Anna again. 1762 became the year of huge changes for Catherine. Empress Elizabeth died in January and Peter ascended the throne. He began undoing her policies and kept a submissive position towards his idol and Russia's enemy, Frederick the Great, much to the displeasure of his own court and military. The bloody 7 Years' War ravaged Europe, and the German-born Peter dressed in his nation's military uniforms, telling people that they shouldn't be fighting his native Prussia. Peter was now making threats against Catherine's life, whilst also drunkenly parading his coarse mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova, a Russian noblewoman and lady-in-waiting. Accounts portray Elizaveta as extremely uncouth. She swore like a soldier, squinted her eyes, smelled bad and spat while talking. And she was a scullery maid of the lowliest kind. Catherine wrote of her as very ugly, extremely dirty child. Ironically, Elizaveta's own sister, Ekaterina, an influential noblewoman and a major figure of the Russian Enlightenment, was a close friend of Catherine's. In July that same year, just 6 months after the increasingly sadistic and hated Peter had become emperor, Catherine, her loyal allies and lovers went after Peter with even the help of Katerina. Peter tried to escape by taking a boat to an island military base, hoping that the fleet remained loyal to him. However, the fleet opened fire on Peter's boat and he was repulsed back to the shore, with the commandant declaring that he recognized no emperor and that Russia was ruled by Empress Catherine. After learning that the Senate, army and fleet had sworn allegiance to Catherine, with the aid of 2 guards whom Peter had planned to discipline, the emperor was arrested and forced to sign a document of abdication on the 9th of July 1762, leaving no one to dispute Catherine's accession to the throne. Even Peter's idol, Frederick the Great, said of him, "He allowed himself to be dethroned like a child sent off to bed." 8 days after the coup that amazed the outside world, Peter died, possibly assassinated, but it is not known how. The official cause after an autopsy was a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplectic stroke. The Empress arranged her bitter rival Elizaveta's marriage to an army colonel of humble yet noble background and ordered the couple to withdraw to the countryside, where she spent the rest of her days in bitterness and ill health. Despite his generally poor reputation, Peter made some progressive reforms during his short reign. He proclaimed religious freedom and encouraged education, sought to modernize the Russian army, abolished the secret police, which had been infamous for its extreme violence, and made it illegal for landowners to kill their serfs without going to court. Catherine, now with the added title, the Great, was crowned as Empress in Moscow in September that year and reversed some of Peter's reforms, but carrying through others. Under Catherine, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, Russia experienced a renaissance of culture and sciences which led to the founding of many new cities, universities and theatres, and the recognition of Russia as one of the great powers of Europe. The attitude of the 8 million Russian serfs towards their autocrat had historically been a positive one, although 95% of Russia was agricultural and barely even noticed any of Catherine's almost exclusively urban reforms. As the serfs had no political power or voice, they repeatedly rioted to convey their stark messages. Many other factors angered the peasants as well, including crop failures, epidemics, and the nobles were imposing a stricter rule than ever, reducing the land of each serf and restricting their freedoms further. By 1772, Catherine had ruled for 10 years alone, before the anger of the serfs boiled over into serious rebellion, which ultimately failed and in fact even backfired, as Catherine was now repelled by the idea of serf liberation. Catherine had borne 6 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood: Alexei, Elizabeth and Paul, her successor. Paul had been tutored by Penin, a rejected suitor of his mother's, and, bitter and scorned, Penin started turning young Paul against his mother. Gradually he became as despicable as Peter had been. A devastating bout of typhus had warped his face, giving him a pug-nosed appearance. Catherine knew that Paul, with whom she ignored as he was becoming like his father, could pose a threat to her, so she distracted him with marriage. Not anyone too powerful. So she decided upon a German princess named Wilhelmina, who went by Natalia in Russia. But the new princess was overbearing, impetuous and cold. Everyone could see it except for Paul, but Catherine read her like a book. Natalia spent lavishly without a care in the world, soon racking up massive debts. She also refused to listen to anyone and couldn't be bothered to learn Russian. Most dangerously, Natalia started plotting against Catherine. If she could make Paul the Tsar, as he did everything she said anyway, would make her the most powerful woman in Russia. But disaster struck. 2 years had passed, and yet no babies were in sight. Rumours began that she was sleeping around. But in 1776, she finally became pregnant. Contractions lasted for days, yet her body simply couldn't give birth naturally. Finally, after several excruciating hours of pushing, the child died in the womb. Natalia had no time to grieve, however, as she had caught an infection during the labour. By the time the infection began working through her body, she had no strength left. 5 days after this awful ordeal began, Grand Duchess Natalia finally gave birth to a stillborn son, then died herself. After grieving, Paul focused back on plotting against his mother. Just 6 months after he became a widower, Paul married the stunning Sophia Dorothea, another German princess. Just a year after their marriage, Maria gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Alexander, his heir. Once Paul had a living wife, Catherine pretty much lost interest in him. Instead, she focused all her time and attention on her many scandalous lovers, showering them with praise, influence, and gifts. Perhaps statesman Grigory Potemkin was exalted the highest amongst them, being awarded titles and high status at court. He was compliant with her sexual demands and, by 1780, wishing to keep on good terms, they both agreed that he would remain as her chief advisor, whilst romantically she could take on yet more lovers. Catherine by this time was doting her attention on her young grandson, Alexander, even hinting that she might pass his own father Paul over and make him the heir instead. Catherine herself implied very strongly that her husband Peter was not Paul's biological father. Naturally, Paul was angered and remembered this. Aged 67 in 1796, Catherine died of a stroke. Later, several rumours circulated regarding the cause and manner of her death. The most infamous of these rumours is that she died after having sex with her horse. This rumour was widely circulated by satirical British and French publications at the time. In his 1647 book, German scholar Adam Illyrius had made claims about a supposed Russian tendency towards bestiality with horses, and this was often repeated in anti-Russian literature throughout the 17th and 18th centuries to illustrate the alleged barbarous Asian nature of Russia. Given the frequency which this story was repeated together with Catherine's love of her adopted homeland and her love of horses, it is likely that these details were conflated. Catherine had almost certainly been targeted for being a woman, unmarried and sexually independent. Upon his accession, Paul sought to avenge his deposed father, reversing Catherine's policies and reburying her alongside his father, Peter, Catherine's hated husband. Paul's strict Prussian-type army reforms made him deeply unpopular amongst the Russian nobility and army, and, like his equally hated father before him, he was brutally assassinated by his own officers. When Paul wouldn't sign the papers, one of the conspirators struck out with his sword. After first blood, the frenzy started. The other men joined in, stabbing, strangling, and trampling the hapless Tsar to death. Even Paul's 23-year-old son and successor, Alexander, gave consent to this action, and he never punished the assassins. Marie Antoinette was born in Austria in 1755, and she became Queen of France in 1774 when her husband ascended the throne as Louis XVI. She could play the harp, the harpsichord and the flute, and she was known to have had a beautiful voice as well as having excelled at dancing. She did, however, spend heavily on fashion, luxuries and gambling, even though the country was facing a grave financial crisis and the population was suffering. By the time of the Flour War of 1775, a series of riots due to the high price of flour and bread had damaged her reputation among the general public. The famous expression, "let them eat cake," was not uttered by Marie Antoinette, but rather by her predecessor, Marie-Thérèse, the wife of the Sun King Louis XIV. It's since been attributed to Marie to show how callous and out of touch with reality she was in regard to the plight of the starving peasants. Of course, she never said this in response to being told the peasants had no bread, but it suited the revolutionaries' agenda to paint her as an uncaring, unsympathetic queen who lived a life of extravagance and decadence while her subjects hungered. Through her own lavish spending and intervention in politics, she became increasingly unpopular among the poverty-stricken people. Political pamphlets accusing her of being dissolute, promiscuous, allegedly having illegitimate children, and harbouring sympathies for France's perceived enemies, especially her native Austria. Eventually, Marie Antoinette's reputation was no better than that of the favourites of previous kings. Many French people were beginning to blame her for the degrading economic situation, suggesting the country's inability to pay off its debt was the result of her wasting the crown's money. Even her own mother, Maria Theresa, expressed concern over her daughter's spending habits, citing the civil unrest it was beginning to cause. This is partly true, of course. The French nobility at the time refused to change their decadent bohemian lifestyles and reform, as the new king bade them early in his reign. During the Revolution, Marie became known as Madame Déficit, because the country's financial crisis was blamed on her lavish spending and her opposition to the social, financial reforms of Turgot and Necker. Yet she could be kind and benevolent. In 1790, Marie Antoinette heard that one of her husband's ushers and his wife had died within a few months of each other, leaving 3 orphaned girls. She adopted them. The 2 older girls were placed in a convent where all expenses were paid by the Queen. Jean Amilcar, an African slave boy from French Senegal, was adopted too. He was bought by local slavers by the French official Chevalier de Boufflers, who wished to spare him the deadly transatlantic crossing and presented him to Queen Marie Antoinette as a gift. By 1789, France was hurtling toward revolution as the result of bankruptcy brought on by the country's support of the American Revolution and high food prices due to drought, all of which was exacerbated by propagandists whose central object of scorn and ridicule was the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. The revolution saw the abolishment of the monarchy in 1792, with Louis XIV being executed in January 1793. Antoinette was accused of high treason and incestuous relations with her own son, Louis Charles. It was after a 2-day trial that a jury found her guilty, and she also was executed by guillotine in October 1793, aged 38. And what of her 4 children? The youngest, Sophie, died of tuberculosis in 1787 at 11 months old, as did Louis Joseph, aged 7, 2 years later. Louis Charles, arguably Louis XVII of France for a while, died at the age of 10 from tuberculosis whilst in prison, where he received several beatings by his captors. The oldest, Marie-Thérèse, the only one who lived to adulthood, was also jailed for 3 years, where she may have become pregnant after abuse by her captors, which was referred to in a letter from a family friend at the Spanish court in 1795. She later wed her cousin, Louis-Antoine d'Angoulême, moving between England, Scotland, Austria, and a sad, memory-evoking return to France. She died of pneumonia aged 79,